Ladies and gentlemen, we've got a major update on the Russia-Ukraine war, with Donald Trump very angry, saying he's going to make a major announcement in the coming days. People expecting massive sanctions to be levied on Russia. Of course, this was tried by NATO during the Biden administration. It did not work out to where they wanted to try and wait out Russia and heavily sanction them and hurt their economy significantly to make the war not really worth it for Russia. We know at this point Russia, they have all of Crimea that they annexed in 2014, and they have large swaths of land in the four easternmost oblasts within Ukraine. And Trump has offered a 7-point peace plan that includes the annexation of those territories to Russia. But the Russians seemingly want more territory. Now Trump is saying you will be seeing things happen in response to what Russia is doing on the battlefield and their actions. There's a 10-second clip, and then we've got a few other things in regards to Trump and Putin, potential negotiations, and also ramping up more arms, believe it or not, to Ukraine in a way in which is different and unique from how the Democrats did it. It is Trump forcing the European NATO countries to foot the bill for U.S. weaponry that will be sent to Ukraine. But we know Trump is able to swing this because everyone says, well, now it's just the same thing. This is what the liberals did. It's sanctions and it's support in terms of arms for Ukraine to try and pressure Russia into backing down, even though if it's just Russia against Ukraine, even with the extra weapons for Ukraine, there's no way Ukraine could beat Russia directly just based off the overall manpower. The other question is, how is the Ukrainian military at this point in terms of the amount of manpower they have? It's been reported for over a year they're running out of soldiers, but they're still here. They're still fighting even through this Russian offensive, the summer offensive. There's some really, really big stuff going on in eastern Ukraine that's really bad. And I think Trump wants to end it, but it seems like at this point he realizes you're not going to be able to end it unless you are able to pressure Russia, and how he deems pressuring them is potentially through massive sanctions and funding to Ukraine. Yes, this is the exact same thing that the Biden administration did, although it is different because think about it, we've got two different things at play here. We've got the mineral deal. Basically, anything we give Ukraine, we will get back, hopefully, in rare earth minerals from Ukraine in a mining extraction. And then the other big thing is this NATO deal where we're selling our weaponry to NATO and the European countries, and then they're going to be giving it to Ukraine. And then also Trump threatening Putin and threatening Russia. We think that's because there's going to be the sanctions that get levied back on, and maybe the use of some other countries to really cripple Russia in terms of potentially exporting some of their materials that they trade with other countries, maybe getting some help from India there in terms of India not accepting Russian imports. That could certainly help put pressure on Russia, which would be a unique thing that really hasn't been tried before. So let's see what Trump says right here.
Russian drones hit a maternity hospital in Ukraine overnight.
I know. You'll be seeing things happen.
Right. So the reporter said Russian drones hit a maternity hospital, basically saying, this is terrible. This is a serious crime, even during warfare. And then Trump says you'll be seeing things happening. So we know what's going on here. We understand the funding. And you can see Trump says NATO will provide and pay for weapons to Ukraine. Trump told NBC Thursday that he struck a deal with NATO for the U.S. to send weapons to Ukraine through the alliance, and that NATO will pay for those weapons 100%, basically insinuating a lot of the bill will be footed by the European powers, as this war is much more important to them than it is the United States. And this is one of the major differences that Republicans and Democrats have on this war. It is the threat level that Russia poses. That's why you see a lot of different strategies, a lot of different opinions when it comes to how much we should entertain Eastern European theater, when it comes to what Russia is doing in their military operation, their invasion of Ukraine. Liberals say, well, and I think a lot of this is from EU propaganda because it's so important for the European Union. They're landlocked with Russia. Look at how close a lot of those countries are to Russia. They know that, well, if Ukraine completely falls, like that's another thing that I don't understand. A lot of this is just the fog of war. They're like, well, Ukraine is going to lose. Well, what does that mean? Like what does that mean? They're losing. They've lost like 1/5 of their territory. Russia, they have, I mean, nobody knows the true numbers in terms of, you don't want to say how hard Russia is going in this war, but obviously, if Russia really wanted to rev it up and truly try and take Ukraine, we would expect there to be a much bigger offensive going on than what there is now. So you have to wonder, well, does Russia really want all of Ukraine at this point? Would they settle for a split? Would they settle for just the 4 eastern oblasts? Do they want more than that? Is this maybe a different play to where them gaining more ground within Ukraine could be leverage and negotiating leverage against NATO during a peace deal to get them other things outside of the territory? There's a lot going on here. There's a lot going on. And so you just have to wonder, what Trump is doing here, this is relative to, I know people say, well, you're funding Ukraine, that's not good. The issue for Trump is you could do one of two things, and there are a lot of Republicans that say Trump should just stay out of it and it's let Europe fight it. And in a way, this is kind of doing this, although not really, because it is our weapons, but we are forcing NATO as a whole, which is mainly the European powers, to pay. And you also have, in a way, Trump influencing NATO pretty heavily. This doesn't surprise me that Trump is doing this. He's trying to have the best of both worlds. Basically, he went to the NATO summit. He was really buddy-buddy with them. We knew there was going to be some type of a thing to come out of that, and it seems like this is what came out of the NATO summit, this agreement to where he can say to his Republican base, they're the ones paying for it. We're getting all of our money back that we send directly to Ukraine in terms of weaponry to Ukraine in mineral deals. Now, you can speculate on whether or not that will happen, but that is a deal to where we will get rare earth minerals from Ukraine, probably central Ukraine, western Ukraine. The Donbass region certainly has a lot. I know there was another previous rumor that was out there a few months ago when Trump and Putin had a little bit better of a relationship than they currently have after everything that's happened the past few months with Russia really launching offensives and Trump not liking it because it's made him look dumb with all of his peace deals that he's tried, his ceasefires that he's tried, his calls with Putin, where Putin will launch drone attacks after. So it's not good at this point when it comes to the relationship between Trump and Putin. It can certainly be salvaged, and that's what they're trying to do by forcing Russia into, trying to pressure Russia into accepting some type of deal with this rearmament, this heavy rearmament now of Ukraine. But I think the question is, originally we were going to potentially do some type of Donbass deal with Russia because there's also resources there that are plentiful, and that at this point doesn't seem like it's going to happen, obviously, but that would be the annexed territory, the Donbass region. So this is the announcement. We'll see. I would imagine the next major announcement by Trump, he said it's coming, is sanctions against Russia, as we shift now to maybe, and you don't want to say paying attention to, but this is just how the news cycle works. First, it's Palestine and Israel, then it's Iran and Israel, and then now we're shifting to Russia, Ukraine again. And so the question here is, when it comes to the funding package that Trump provides through NATO, will that be enough to maybe force Russia's hand to the negotiating table? It's very important. When you look at Vladimir Putin and what they have said we're not interested in a ceasefire. For them, it doesn't make sense because they have the advantage in terms of the military, in terms of the manpower. Why would they accept a ceasefire if there's very little chance of a peace deal? They're only slowing their own armies down. So that's another thing you have to take into account when it comes to this. It's like if there's going to be a ceasefire, there is already the major agreement on a peace deal. And also, what does Ukraine and what do the European powers think about Russia getting land within Ukraine? I'm sure Ukraine's not going to like it, but at a certain point, there's just no way, and this is what I've said all the time about Russia, Ukraine, and where we're at in terms of the annexed land, unless there is some type of extensive NATO involvement, which extensive would mean NATO troops, which would be escalation, which they're not going to do. They didn't do it under Biden when Biden and the Democrats were a lot more war happy in defending Ukraine. So it's either NATO troops to try and take that land back that is currently under Russian occupation, or it would be some type of crazy threat to Russia and just boycott in terms of like trade with pretty much all the countries coming together against Russia, which would force Russia, and that would be indirectly like a sanction, which is what they originally wanted to do against Russia. But I don't believe that's going to work. Even when Trump puts his major sanctions on, unless he's able to swing something crazy with like China and India cutting off their imports from Russia, which I don't think is going to happen, especially with China, that would pressure Russia significantly more than the Democrats did with their sanctions. But if you just do similar sanctions to what the Democrats did, I mean, I'm sure there's going to be other differences because the Democrats' sanctions necessarily didn't work very well. I mean, they work to a degree, but they don't work to nudge Russia off of this war, and basically it's a pressure tactic to get them to agree to a peace deal. But if you want that land back, there's just no way to really get it back, especially with what Russia has expended. Because now Putin and the Russian military is thinking that land now, that's ours. I mean, they already think it is theirs. You go back to even that Tucker Carlson interview, Putin goes into a spiel, justifying the invasion, talking about century-old history on the territory, and they did own the territory under the Russian Empire, under the Soviet Union, and they lost it. Ukraine, obviously, as an independent country, claims it since 1991, but they think it's theirs and they think they're justified to get it. The question is, at this point, I wonder what the intelligence says on Russia reassessing the situation and saying, well, we'll be happy with 2/5 of it. We'll be happy with half of Ukraine, splitting it in half. We'll be happy with 1/5 of it, which is basically what they have now, around 19% of total land. It might be more than 19% because they are in a offensive, but the last I checked, it was like 19.1% of Ukrainian land was controlled by Russia. And so you have to wonder, what does Russia want? What do they want? All of Ukraine still? Do they want half of it? Did they ever want all of it? Because a lot of people said that, well, they would just split Ukraine right back in 2022, March of 2022, when it really broke out. But now, I mean, they're really struggling to even get 1/5 of it, and I think they want more than that, or they want some type of leverage over the West. And they talk about, well, we just don't want any more NATO expansion. Well, NATO has already expanded pretty much throughout Eastern Europe at this point, and other countries joined after the invasion. So there was more expansion after the invasion, like Finland, and now there's all this talk of Putin possibly stationing troops on the border of Finland. He's not going to invade or anything like that. That would be terrible because that would trigger Article 5. That's one of the things with all of these. You got to be careful with NATO, man. I mean, NATO just completely escalates into full-fledged World War III, the second Article 5. Well, I don't want to say that for sure because you don't know the full fundamentals of a situation, but, if you get an Article 5 triggered, and look, I understand it's a deterrent, so countries don't invade smaller countries. The United States would defend the smaller countries, so the bigger country's not going to invade the smaller country, but still. That's a powerful thing when you've got Article 5. That's why people say, well, NATO for the United States in 2025, it doesn't make sense like it did in 1949. And it's understandable. It's a completely different time. It's fundamentally different. And that's really the thing that we try and get liberals to understand. When we're arguing about Russia and how much we should invest in defending Ukraine against Russia and not allowing Russia land grabs, our disagreement is mainly on our fear of Russia, the amount that we fear Russia. I would assume liberals have a very globalist type view to where the European countries are so important. If anything happens to any of them, it's like it's happening to the United States, and we must help them and prevent Russia from taking anything, as opposed to the more U.S.-centric, isolationist, if you will, view of, well, I mean, that's Eastern European theater. That's their war. There's a lot of very, very powerful countries in Europe that can I don't want to say easily, but can certainly help Ukraine. I mean, you could also make the argument defending Ukraine as a deterrent. If you allow Russia to take Ukraine, it's going to embolden them potentially in the other Baltic states, which they could potentially pick off. But that is the more fear-mongering approach. Let's understand the fundamentals of this. They've gotten in 3 years, they've gotten 1/5 of Ukraine. They've expended hundreds of thousands and thousands of men, millions and millions and billions of dollars invested in terms of weaponry. They've gotten 1/5. There's been no NATO troop involvement. So maybe we might be fear-mongering and overestimating Russia at this point in terms of their military. Now, the goal is de-escalation. That's what Trump wanted. We know Russia with the nuclear weapons, and they understand if, they escalate to that point, it's probably going to end very bad for them, but it's also going to end very badly for other parts of the world as well, because then you get into the nuclear war, and something that we all want to avoid. The key, that's why Trump came in and said he wants de-escalation. The number one goal is de-escalation, and we'll give up 1/5 of the country. And if the European countries don't want to do that, I mean, it's just so hard, because how do you get that land back? You can sanction them to death. That's the proxy warfare, which is potentially going to pressure them, but it hasn't worked in the past. So Trump might roll out new, unique sanctions that could hurt Russia significantly more, which would be a very odd twist considering the opinion of both sides, Republicans and Democrats, to where, imagine Trump is the one to press the right buttons on the sanctions against Putin to get him to agree to some type of peace deal. It would be very ironic. As opposed to liberals, they were extremely sanction heavy, and it didn't deter Putin at all. Now, it is a different time. The Russian army's a bit more exhausted now that we are over 3 years into this war. But there's just so many different factors that play. And fundamentally, Russia does not like their current standing. Putin has strung Trump along, and now Trump is done with it. He's just done with it. You know, they've had several different phone conversations over the past 3 or 4 months. They've gone nowhere. Putin says, well, we're working to something, we're working to something, we're working to something. And remember, Ukraine was the original agreeer to the initial ceasefire. Putin said, I'll agree to it, but I have to talk to Trump first. Then he calls Trump, he talks to him, and there's no agreement to it. Or they did agree to a partial ceasefire. It was like an infrastructure ceasefire, and it didn't last. It really didn't matter when you have something like that, to where they're still fighting, but you can't hit any of the critical infrastructure. I mean, that's a very flimsical deal, as it's not even a real ceasefire. So what we would want is, at this point, if you want the war ended, it probably, there's 2 camps. You could either say, screw it, let Europe deal with it, Trump shouldn't be doing any of this. And that's why Trump is trying to stage this as, well, NATO is paying for it, and a lot of the European powers like Germany, France, the UK, they're the ones footing the bill for this. Yes, it's our weaponry. We're selling it, though. But there's people that say the United States should just stay out. Germany has a massive economy, a huge GDP. France, the UK, I mean, Poland, these are powerful countries. They could handle this themselves. And then there's the other side, to where the only way this ends is through significant pressure on Russia, because right now, if you don't pressure Russia, Russia can continue this war and continue taking little swaths of land and use it as a war of attrition. We know the Russians do this in their country's history. They're very good at wars of attrition. And so you wait for the summer, you launch an offensive, which is what they're doing now, to possibly gain more land and reset up a new border. So we'll have to see. But either way, guys, that's just the situation. It does seem like in the coming days there will be some type of huge sanctions. I do wonder the strategy behind the sanctions and what Trump will do. And we also do have the update on Trump giving Ukraine weapons via NATO, so that it's not going to be fully paid by the United States. It doesn't even matter. Technically, we already have a deal with Ukraine for their minerals. If we give Ukraine $20 billion worth of weapons, we have a right to extract $20 billion worth of rare earth minerals. Although I actually don't think the deal is that simple. I believe basically we get half of what we get Ukraine gets, or something like that, when it comes to extraction. But whether or not you actually think extraction is even going to happen, that's another story for another day. But that's the goal at the end of the war. So we'll see. And that's kind of how Trump can market it, and then also market it by saying, well, see, we're really not paying for it. NATO's paying for it, insinuating that a lot of the European countries will foot the bill, which was a Republican stance from the beginning. So even if you say, well, this is a similar strategy to what liberals did, it's heavy funding of Ukraine in terms of weaponry, and it's also sanctions on Russia, we are forcing the European countries to pay for this. So it would be considered different than what liberals were doing, which was basically allowing the European countries, and they were doing the whole, it's a fair to where we all pitch in the same exact amount. And of course the United States, because when you scale our GDP and our overall military budget, we're going to be giving by far the most. That's why you saw numbers to where we were giving 190, 200 billion in total. And the next closest country was way under 100 billion because of how big our military budget is. And they say, well, that's fair. Well, no, it's not fair. You want to know why it's not fair? Because of the Atlantic Ocean. We do not view Russia as the same threat as those landlocked European countries. So those European countries should be pitching in much more than the United States. Even if you want to factor in the GDP ratio, those European countries need to be pitching in way more because of the proximity. The proximity factor is much more important for them. And so that's what Trump was saying. That's why Trump mentioned the Atlantic Ocean and the fact that we do not share the same concern. I mean, technically, if you want to be honest about Alaska with Bering Strait, we are very close to Russia, but obviously that's an uninhabited territory mainly, and that's not where any type of offensive from Russia would come. So we just don't view Russia as the same threat. But either way, guys, make sure you like the video down below. Also follow me on X. Link to that's always in the description.